You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 336 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show is Will Porter. Will Porter, of course, is a journalist who has written at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and the Libertarian Institute, where you can find this show, My Daily News Roundup. But his new gig is a staff writer at RT. So, Will, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kyle. How you doing?
Doing well, and it's exciting to see Will now getting published at RT. I'll go ahead and link to his first article there in the show notes page. That way, y'all could take the time to read it, and I'm sure we're going to get to it and talk about it on today's show. But as I'm sure y'all expect, that the big thing me and Will have to talk about today is the arrest of Julian Assange. I did break it down on the last show, but some of the events and details I think have been cleared up since. So, Will, why don't you go ahead and kind of just give us the status of where Julian Assange is?
Yeah, sure. So I think your listeners are probably aware, as you reported on your show, that Julian Assange was arrested last Thursday, April 11th. But maybe before we get into the implications of what it means, I've seen a lot of confusions about just like the different charges against him and the warrants and stuff. So maybe we can kind of clear some of that up first. So Assange was arrested on an outstanding arrest warrant in the UK for skipping out on bail in 2012 and not surrendering himself to the police. And this was all related to sexual assault allegations that came from women in Sweden. So you had two separate things going on here. You had the allegations in Sweden, and then you had the British arrest warrant. And so in 2012, instead of turning himself in, Assange went to the Ecuadorian embassy and was granted asylum there, political asylum. And at the time, Assange was fearing that he'd not only be extradited to Sweden for the sexual assault allegations, but then also to the U.S. possibly because of, classified material he had been publishing through WikiLeaks. Now, the Swedish investigations had all been dropped by 2017, so that stuff is not currently active. However, the British arrest warrant related to all that stuff remained, it's still considered legally valid. However, until last week, the British authorities could not go into the embassy and get him because of Assange's asylum. And I know you've covered this a lot on the show, but in 2017, Ecuador got this new president, Lenin Moreno, and he's not been as friendly to Assange. And so he basically, came up with a pretext to take away Assange's asylum. And this is what allowed the cops to come in there and grab him. And so Assange now has been found guilty for this 2012 skipping bail charge. And apparently he's going to be sentenced for that in May. However, the U.S. now wants Assange too. And they've actually unsealed an indictment accusing him of this conspiracy crime related to Chelsea Manning and helping her obtain documents. And so Assange is now facing this UK skipping bail charge, and now he's facing possibly extradition to the United States. Now, the U.S. indictment, it basically, the majority of the indictment describes things that pretty much any good reporter would do to get, information from a source and to protect their source and themselves. But the indictment says that Assange helped Manning somehow break some password into a government computer. It's not really clear what their evidence is. They don't really give much. It's not clear if this would even hold up in court, but that is what they're now charging him with. And I think that this conspiracy charge is just like the beginning of all this. Like they want to start with this like relatively minor charge, which only has I think a 5-year prison sentence. And they want to make the extradition not seem as seem so brutal, as opposed to something that carries a greater penalty. However, once Assange is in the U.S., I think they're going to throw the book at him really hard. And finally, I'll say just in terms of like Assange's current status, Sweden may, right now they're looking to maybe reopen one of these sexual assault things. And so he may be extradited to Sweden as well as the U.S., one or the other or both.
Yeah, so there's a few things I want to add in here. The first is that the confusion has been really unbelievable, especially when you have U.S. senators like Richard Blumenthal saying that Assange is being brought up on charges related to the 2016 election. Completely different set of elites. And, this is a U.S. senator, so we really don't have a whole lot of people really understand what's going on. A lot of the narrative has been around a hack, and that's because of the Justice Department's own press release on this thing, which said that it was, hacking charges and not conspiracy charges. There's two really good breakdowns of the charges that I'll link to in the show notes page. One by Glenn Greenwald and one by Trevor Timm. And they both go through and first of all explain that, as Will said, the ads here are ads that a journalist undertakes. Basically, in one case, Assange was looking to set up a situation where Manning could access documents that I believe she could have accessed anyways, but done so in an account that would allow her to remain anonymous. So this is essentially just an ad to protect Manning's privacy and not to actually hack in and steal any documents. And then the other charge is related to just asking Manning, what kind of information is there. And I guess they're claiming that he encouraged Manning to give up all the documentation, which, it really, I don't think is a crime in itself. And this is something that, legendary journalists like Bob Perry, the point that they made, that you actually have an obligation as a journalist to ask your source for more information. I mean, somebody even as mainstream as Bob Woodward apparently said that had Edward Snowden given him those documents, he would have told Snowden to, remain in the NSA as a mole. And so if those are the positions of even mainstream journalists, then, it's clear that what Assange is doing here are not crimes, but just, the steps and acts that people take as journalists. And, Will, now as, paid journalist, so I guess you call him professional. I consider myself much more of a, amateur, but like I see this as a threat, especially if, I ever have important enough information that people care about and I have enough of an audience to say it to, simply asking somebody like, hey, can you give me the documentation to confirm this? Or do you know anything about this, event that seems related to me? Hell, maybe that's enough to wind me up in jail here. A couple other things. I know the extradition with the UK always makes a big deal out of the death penalty and says they won't extradite to a country with the death penalty. My guess is the US gets an end run around this somehow. Rather, it's giving the UK some kind of guarantee or confirmation that they won't bring charges against Assange that results in the death penalty, which I'm sure we could later go back on because, what is international law and guarantees anyways? I mean, Julian Assange was granted Ecuadorian citizenship, and yet his government just turned him over to another government without any, real due process on that because the government of Ecuador right now is extremely corrupt. To talk about the extradition here real quick, because I think there's some confusion on this as well. The extradition agreement that the U.S. has with the UK, to my understanding, for the UK to extradite somebody to the U.S. under their court and legal proceedings, which I guess they care about to some extent still in the UK, upholding their tradition of law, says that it has to be a crime in both countries. And so to, claim that this is a crime in the UK may be something of a stretch. And so if they're able to extradite Assange first to Sweden, then there's looser extradition agreements. And so Sweden may be much quicker or more likely to extradite Assange to the United States if he is extradited there first. And that, that's been the real threat. I think Assange has, publicly stated that he's willing, if he's given a guarantee, to go to Sweden to actually face the sexual assault allegations that I believe even the UN panel on arbitrary detention said the evidence for that was pretty thin. So, there's a lot of options here, but it looks like a bad scenario from the status quo for Assange.
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying, I think Assange has been pretty much worried about that from the get-go, that, if he is extradited to Sweden, that they would then send him to the United States. That is his ultimate fear, and that's what led him to take refuge in the embassy in the first place. And so now it looks like he may be facing that situation again.
So, Will, I guess one of the things I want to ask you about is, from minding your perspective, that this is an attack on journalism. And yet, I can't, I think of a lot of names, but I felt like the general attitude when I watched media, and I, can't watch a whole lot of mainstream media, but I do tune into Dave Smith and Jimmy Dore, and I watched a clip on Tucker Carlson where he brought up names of quite a few journalists. Michael Nance was one that I recognize. I guess he's more of a CNN analyst than a journalist, but all these people really celebrating, and saying that, the indictments against Julian Assange don't affect us. Of course, all of them, start off their statement by saying Julian Assange is a bad guy. Don't get me wrong. And then it's either, and that's why he deserves to hang, or, but maybe we shouldn't prosecute him for this. But there is an awful lot of sentiment in the mainstream establishment media, Will, that says, good, we avoided this one. And, we bypassed what Obama called like the New York Times problem. So why don't you go into all that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you're saying, like there was quite a bit of like outright, even up to outright celebration on Twitter and stuff from some of these mainstream journalists, joking that he looks like Uncle Albert. And one reporter said something like, oh, journalists pre and post Brexit. And they showed a picture of Assange looking clean cut and then him on the day of his arrest. Just making, generally having a good time of it. And I think this is obviously related to all the smear campaign devoted to trying to tie Assange to Russia in the 2016 election. Because previous to that, Assange was held by a lot of people to be a kind of a hero and someone who facilitated whistleblowing. The president Trump, I think during the election said something about he loves WikiLeaks, whereas now he's saying I've never heard of him. So I don't know. There's been a lot of changing attitudes on WikiLeaks, but especially from I think some of these more left-leaning and liberal reporter types. And as I said, I think that has a lot to do with the 2016 election that sort of just like smeared him. I saw a lot of newspaper, even like their editorial boards taking positions against him. Like USA Today, said something about he's no hero, and it was because of the Russia stuff. And so, yeah, it's unfortunate to see that kind of reaction from our media. I think it says a lot about the state of journalism, not only in the U.S. but all over the world, really, in the UK and the West, and a lot of places.
Yeah, I forgot who brought this one up, but one of the shows I was listening to said, the best way to see it, and it may have been Dave Smith, is compare this to the Jim Acosta reaction, where, Jim Acosta press pass was revoked for the White House for a few days, and they immediately declared it as an attack on the media and one of the great outrages of the Trump presidency. Really one of the biggest ones not dealing directly with Russia. And then you actually have an indictment in a court that, largely is secret. They said that, I guess the judge in this case pretty much handpicked the case that she wants to oversee. And I think she did like, Kariakou and a couple other whistleblower, maybe Jeffrey Sterling's. And so you have this great injustice about to happen here. And, you don't even have as much concern as when Jim Acosta has his press pass taken away for a couple of days. It's astounding to me.
Yeah, they're very selective in who gets to leak information in Washington and in the press, I guess. If you're not leaking it through like the approved, the CIA approved channels at the Washington Post or whatever, you're like a pariah. They're going to try to destroy you. And that kind of seems like what's happened here with Assange.
So I do want to go through some of the other reaction. Let's start off with the good one, Will. Who's the one presidential candidate that came out and said good things about, Julian Assange here and condemned his arrest?
Yeah, of course, the great anti-war Democrat candidate, Tulsi Gabbard. She came out very strongly against the arrest and extradition effort. I think that was great to see. I saw a tweet. I'm not sure if she had a more substantial statement. Did you see anything like that?
Yeah, she was on CNN.
Okay, hell yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to find that clip and link to that in the show notes page as well. Yeah, but she on Twitter, 100% on this. It's an attack on journalism. So as always, you pretty much when I talk about it on the show, good job, Tulsi Gabbard. You're the one getting this right. Now, the other thing in the negative worth mentioning here is none of the others have had the courage to weigh in, to take a position one way or the other, even, as far as it goes. Even like Bernie Sanders isn't weighing in on this. Elizabeth Warren, where are, even the quote unquote progressives of the group aren't, taking a stand on this. So that's really disappointing to see.
Yeah, I really would have hoped that even not even a presidential candidate, but someone like Ocasio-Cortez. I don't think she may have, but I haven't seen anything from her. But as I said, I do think this has a lot to do with the Russia thing. I think that's sort of that's the tension there, that maybe some of these progressive candidates would have the instinct to come out in favor of Assange, but they're fearing that they can't because of the Russia stuff, that he's like radioactive because of that.
One of the most disturbing reactions was Joe Manchin. So I guess I'll let you take on that one, Will.
Yeah, this Democrat Senator Joe Manchin. I'm blanking on the rest of his quote, but one part of his quote was Assange is our property, demands that he's our property and, demands his extradition. So he was one of the more hawkish people to come out on this.
Yeah, I also saw Sass, Adam Schiff, and Mark Warner, the second to hold, I think, the House and Senate, either like Intelligence Committee chairs or, important chairs. in both, and they're saying, it's good that Assange is arrested here, and most of their complaints against him are towards 2016, which again has nothing to do with the charges against him right here. So, Will, do you have anything else that you want to add here on, Assange's arrest, what you think about the importance, or I don't know if you have any ideas on what's to come or what could be done?
Yeah, sure. But before I get to my broader thoughts, I'll also just maybe include some of the international reaction. We had in the UK over 70 British politicians, most of them from the Labour Party, signing a letter asking the government not to extradite him to the U.S., but saying that they'd be okay if Sweden asked for his extradition. And I believe that includes Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, that he was against the U.S. extradition as well. Now, the UK government has come out, I think, as you referred to, and said they wouldn't extradite Assange to anywhere with the death penalty, since the U.S. obviously has the death penalty, and in Assange's case in particular, he could be charged under the Espionage Act, which could carry the death penalty. Given those things, it seems like the UK shouldn't be able to do it to the US, given their statement that they're not going to send him anywhere with the death penalty. However, something tells me that, as you said, they're going to find some kind of loophole there. And also, in terms of the international reaction, Australia came out and explicitly said they're against the death penalty being applied to Assange at all. And these things it's a little alarming to hear this, like these officials making these statements, because it kind of it sounds like there are genuine worries about this, that Assange is going to be given the death penalty. So that stuff was a little bit alarming for sure, but hoping that doesn't happen, of course. But in terms of the implications, I think Assange's legal problems in the first place are motivated by his journalistic work with WikiLeaks. Like all of this that's happening is because of that. If he weren't who he is, I doubt any of this would even have come about in the first place, including, I think, some of the stuff in Sweden. Like, I think some of that stuff is even trumped up. I can't say for sure, there hasn't been like a legal proceeding there, but as you referred to at the UN, finding that it might be pretty frivolous, like it does seem like it's trumped up. However, if Assange is prosecuted in the U.S. for his work as a publisher, this is a massive blow to a free press, that not only in the U.S., but for the entire planet. Because Assange is not even an American citizen. He's an Australian. So, like, if they can get him for this, if the U.S. can get him for his work as a publisher, then I think they can pretty much get anyone, any other foreign national. Using the Espionage Act against Assange or some other draconian law like this would set an extremely bad precedent. It's going to have some kind of chilling effect on reporters who are working with sources to get them to reveal information. It's just going to set a really bad precedent. It's going to carry on the trend that I think the Obama administration really pushed forward. We may now see the Trump administration sort of carry that on. And,
I guess the last thing I just have to say on it is how great it would be if one of like the 2020 candidates in the left side took the stand of that, if I become elected, I will pardon Julian Assange, and really, stake a claim on that, because that would be a big thing. It's great that, Tulsi Gabbard is supportive, and it sounds like if she becomes president, then whatever attorney general that she's appointed would unlikely go after Julian Assange. But at the same time, to have like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren come out and make that, take that stand, I think it would raise a lot of debate on the situation. It's also, I think, very easy and would be a very powerful point to be able to say, look, right now we're the ones defending the press against Donald Trump, who has attacked the press since day one. And it would be an easy sell, and it would be a great win defending the First Amendment. I'm guessing that none of them stand up and take that bold stance, but it would be great to see.
Yeah. I mean, I hope your listeners are taking note here. I mean, we have Twitter, we have ways of reaching these candidates and stuff. Tulsi is probably the best person for that. Maybe start putting pressure on her for a Pardon Assange campaign. Maybe that's an effort that's worthwhile.
All right. Well, I want to talk about your first article at RT, and that is about Israel, where we had Netanyahu win re-election. So tell us about all the things we need to know about here.
Yeah, sure. So, Benjamin Netanyahu of the right-wing Likud party won a recent election in Israel, as I think you covered on your show. He continues to be the prime minister. Israel's electoral system is different from the way it works in the U.S. It's like they elect parties and like they have to build a governing coalition. However, it looks like Likud is won a pretty decent lead, and they built the coalition. So what this means, though, for Israel-Palestine, I think is a sort of a clear continuation of the status quo. I don't think this represents any massive change. I think more likely it's going to be sort of a continuation of the slow, incremental, expansion of settlements, the squeezing of Gaza slowly under the blockade. We may see occasional flare-ups of violence like we have for the last decade or so, but I think the status quo is something that's kind of entrenched now. You did have Netanyahu, before the elections declaring he's going to annex parts of the West Bank and things like that. Certainly possible he means it, but I kind of think that's more election rhetoric. And I think more we're looking at entrenchment of the status quo. And I mean, don't get me wrong, the status quo is headed towards something horrible, and it's really not sustainable at all. It's just maybe moving in slower motion than maybe some of the more hardline right-wing parties would want it to move. And so, yeah, as I mentioned in my piece that I did for RT on this, Trump had this comment that Netanyahu's win is going to be this great boon for peace of the Palestinians. But I think that's clearly not likely. Trump is referring to his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who's also a White House advisor, apparently has this peace plan he's getting ready to roll out. And the peace plan could involve, there's not a lot of details out about it yet, but it could involve, land swaps with Egypt and Jordan and stuff. But so far we've really seen nothing to suggest that peace is anywhere near, anywhere around the corner, even with that peace plan. We have Trump's, recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We have the acceptance of the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, which was stolen from Syria during the 6-Day War. You have the shutting down of Palestinian diplomatic offices in the U.S. None of this bodes well at all for, peace under Netanyahu. That's just simply, that's not likely. It's implausible to suggest that. Now, we do have some silver lining here for the election. We have the fact that the New Right Party, which is where Naftali Bennett is now at. He used to be of the Jewish Home Party, but he's moved to this New Right coalition. The New Right Party did not make it into the Knesset. They didn't get they didn't pass the threshold. And they're even more hardline than Likud, so it's a good thing they didn't get in. And then conversely, a couple Arab parties actually won seats in the Knesset. However, they actually did worse than they did in the previous election. So they're still in there, but they're trailing. They're lagging. So the Arab parties used to be joined into what was called the Joint List, but they split up for this election. And so for this time around, the Hadash Tal and the Ram Balad, the two Arab parties, got a total of 10 seats. So that's good that they made it in, but last year the Joint Arab List got 13 seats. And so this is actually not good news. And Arab voter turnout was actually historically low this time, which seems like a result of the splitting up of the Joint List. And so we do have some kind of mixed news. We have some silver lining to it, but overall, this is not a good election for the Palestinian cause. It's really kind of inching toward something disastrous.
Well, I know the last time you were on the show, Will, one of the things you mentioned is that the Palestinian issue hadn't been all that big, actually, in this round of elections. But there were a couple things leading up to the elections that happened that the U.S. was involved in, with the U.S. recognizing the Golan Heights as Israeli territory and labeling the IRGC as a terrorist organization, which Netanyahu claimed credit for, saying that, it was me who convinced Trump to do that. So not saying that, I guess, I don't know if that's quite true or if that's just election rhetoric, but do you have any idea if that election rhetoric itself helped Netanyahu? I know going into the elections, it wasn't clear that he was going to be the winner, although it seemed the most likely scenario.
Right. Yeah. I kind of perceived those things more as last ditch efforts to gain voters, because as I did say on the show, the Palestine issue was not made a real big campaign issue. It wasn't a big thing that anyone was campaigning on in the race. They were not saying, I'm going to bring peace for the Palestinians or I'm going to crush them in some new war or something. It was sort of just sidelined as an issue. However, yeah, as you're saying, certainly Netanyahu, taking credit for the whole Golan Heights recognition, saying that, hey, I was the one who got President Trump to accept that, and I'm the one who got Trump to do the Jerusalem thing of recognizing that as the capital. And certainly the IRGC thing, which isn't exactly related to the Palestinians, but still a foreign policy issue for Israel. I sort of perceived those things as election rhetoric more. I'm not sure to what extent Netanyahu was responsible for the IRGC designation, the U.S. calling them a terrorist organization. But it seemed like Netanyahu was just kind of throwing that out there to try to get people to, some of his more right-wing and hardline constituents to vote for him.
Well, yeah, and just one thing that I find interesting is as much as Americans and especially the establishment right now are freaking out about election interference, it seems a little bit like election interference to me that Trump has this buddy-buddy relationship with Netanyahu that Netanyahu certainly played up during the election. I saw lots of pictures of the big billboards around, Trump shaking hands with Netanyahu and a lot of propaganda about Trump's trips to Israel. But in the lead up to the election, and as we know, Netanyahu is kind of struggling to have a solid victory here, leading up to the elections. And there's some corruption charges against him, that are concerning. But, Trump coming out and making this announcement that the Golan Heights is Israeli territory, you would think that maybe is a little bit of election meddling, the way I look at it, especially when this has been an issue for, decades now. It's not like it had to be done right then. Trump could have, realized that it may have an impact on the election and wait till after. Certainly the labeling the IRGC as a terrorist organization, that didn't even take effect till April 15th, actually the day the show's airing. And so while the declaration happened in the days before the election, I don't know, just I think it's worth pointing out.
Yeah, I mean, certainly on the election meddling angle, that is interesting. Like Trump being sort of personally involved in the Israeli election. That's kind of odd. Imagine Vladimir Putin doing that, being on billboards in American campaigns. I think the reaction would be a lot different.
Or just imagine if, Vladimir Putin announced, a withdrawal of Russian troops from Syria in the days leading up to, the 2020 elections, or withdrawing missiles from a certain area. I think there would be Democrats on the left that would, claim that Donald Trump was colluding with Vladimir Putin to get reelected. Certainly those were the claims of Republicans against Barack Obama when he was caught on the hot mic. What was that, in 2012? Talking to Medvedev about the U.S., I think, defense missile systems that were supposed to go into Eastern Europe that I think end up going in anyways, but he says, well, I have more room to negotiate on it after the election. And right. So if Russia didn't adopt a more hostile policy towards the U.S. there, well, I don't know.
Yeah, no doubt.
All right. Well, I guess we should move on and talk about Libya here, because what I've just, I guess, been calling the battle for Tripoli is going on now. On one side, you have the U.S. and UN-backed GNA government that has some militia support. And on the other side, you have a coalition of foreign countries, and an odd coalition of that. I think it includes the UAE, Russia, Egypt, and France, all supporting the general, controlling, I guess, like 3/4 of the country. If you're looking at a clock, I would kind of say like 9 to 12 is controlled by the GNA, and the other 3/4 is controlled by the Haftar government. Field Marshal Haftar here is the guy controlling the other side of the army. So, Will, why don't you kind of let us know where we're at in the battle for the capital here?
Yeah, sure. So just for maybe a little bit of background on Haftar first. Haftar is like a former Libyan general who at some point became a U.S. intelligence asset. And he's the guy who, as you said, has launched this assault on the city of Tripoli, where the UN government of National Accord is based. So Haftar turned on Muammar Gaddafi when he was still the ruler of Libya during Libya's war with Chad in the 1980s. And Haftar was captured in Chad and eventually allowed to move to Langley, Virginia, in a deal with the U.S. And Langley, of course, is the home of the CIA's headquarters. And Haftar, of course, worked with U.S. intelligence agencies for some time after he moved to the U.S. However, ever since 2011, when NATO-backed rebels, invaded Libya and overthrew and killed Gaddafi, Haftar has set up shop there as a major warlord in the country, and he's received all kinds of foreign backing, as you're suggesting. So you have Haftar's Libyan National Army, the LNA, and that this force is sort of marching on Tripoli right now, and they're clashing with the GNA's forces. And the GNA has sort of hired a smattering of militias to fight to protect Tripoli, because they don't really have a great, fighting force. And they've been shelling each other and dropping bombs on each other because both actually have warplanes. And we were talking off air about this, about like, where did Haftar get warplanes and, how does he maintain them and stuff? And I mean, we do know that the Saudis have given him millions of dollars. We know that the UAE has given him vehicles and planes, but we don't really know where he's getting his warplanes from. Some people say Russia is supporting him or whatever, but that's not so clear. So anyway, the assault on Tripoli, though, has been based around this disused airport, the former airport, but it's also kind of moved into a lot of city streets as well. And in terms of just like the impact so far, it's displaced something like 8 or 10,000 people, killed something under 100, like 75, and around like 17 or 20 are civilians, and wounded about 300. And so this is like a pretty brutal fighting. Excuse me. However, the GNA does seem to be putting up some resistance to this so far.
Yeah, and what I was reading for this battle and leading up to it, it was clear that Haftar has the superior military force in Libya right now. He controls most of the country now. It seems that he's cut a lot of deals with the money he's been given. Add to the countries that support him as France. He even received some, I believe, life-saving medical treatment in France within the past 6 months or so. Because I have figured that once he goes to France, well, he's definitely not coming back home. I mean, this guy's a war criminal. There's a video of 8 people being executed in the streets under the Haftar's orders, apparently, and this is like a clear example of a war crime. So there's no doubt it's going on. Like you make the point of, where are these warplanes coming from? It seems to be a real question to me. Like, maintenance on warplanes is serious and has to be done. And so it's not like, Haftar's army, which doesn't seem particularly sophisticated or large to me, will be able to maintain a street of fighter jets. Also, who's selling this guy bombs and stuff like that seems to be an important question. And does he, have the ability to control all of Libya? There's a particular town in western Libya there that is extremely important, Misrata. And there you have a militia that apparently is the one that would have the fighting capabilities able to stop Haftar from taking Tripoli. And they have launched an operation called Volcano of Anger to try to defend the city from Haftar's forces. So even if he does take this city, it seems like he may then have an insurgency on his hands.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the U.S. and the EU and the UN and even like Libyans, there was big protests in the streets, have called for Haftar to stop the offensive. But the rival parliament that he's allied with in Tobruk in the east recently just made a statement that said they're not going to stop this, and they're trying to clear extremists out of Tripoli, I think was their rationale for this.
Yeah, and I guess just for a little bit of context too, it's not like there was peace in the streets of Tripoli before this. I mean, the international airport there was shut down every other week because this local militia broke off of the coalition. Probably want to be paid more or something, so they go to war with the coalition supporting, or the Nets militia supporting the Nets neighborhood over, and they have a little fighting break out there and stuff like that. So Libya has been crazy since the fall of Gaddafi in 2011, and that's really all the U.S. and NATO's fault. One kind of last aspect of this I want to bring up was brought to my attention by a guy me and Will both know. He runs Checkpoint Asia, Marko Marjanovic. He was actually a past guest on the show, I believe episode 202. But this article kind of lays out how you have this really interesting thing where Italy, because their interest is in oil contracts and stopping the flow of migrants, have really backed the GNA and the UN and US-backed government, whereas France, because of their interests, have backed Haftar. And so you have this, European proxy war in Africa. I don't know, like it's, the 1920s again or something like that. It's kind of, I don't know, crazy thing we got going on here in the world, Will.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating. I was actually just recently reading about like the history of Libya. And Libya used to be 3 separate like countries, basically, when they were administered under the Ottoman Empire. You had Cyrenaica, Tripolitania, and Fezzan. And so this place used to be 3 countries, although Italian colonialists like forced it together in the 1930s to be one country. And so you do have a lot of these like imperial and colonial histories of countries like Italy and France in northern Africa. And so you're kind of seeing that at work here. And it's, I think, interesting to see how Libya has broken apart. Previously, there, I think, were 3 major factions, but now you just have the GNA and the Tobruk parliament. But it's sort of interesting to see how it's splitting apart and sort of historically how it used to be split apart. It used to be 3 separate countries. And so I think all that stuff sort of is at play here.
Right. And, we would probably do another 336 shows, Will, just on the ways that kind of the European colonialization, drawing borders and stuff really created problems for Africa. Right now we're looking at revolutions in Algeria and Sudan. Both of those countries had heavy European influence. One of the topics I learned about recently that I'm so interested in is actually the impact, I believe, of Belgian colonialism on Rwanda and how they really created, the Hutu and the Tutsis? Am I remembering those right?
Yeah.
And, they really created those 2 designations that later led to genocide. The way the borders have been drawn up, even between Sudan and South Sudan, have led to years long. I think that was 2010 or 2011 as well, that you had the creation of South Sudan. So we're looking at like an 8-year war now in South Sudan that's, killed tens of thousands and starved tons of people to death too. So just a terrible situation. And I don't know what else to say about it or where I was really going with that. If you don't have anything else to add, Will, you could just kind of plug your stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like, it cannot be overstated. Like, every single thing we talk about in terms of foreign policy, in terms of, like, all these conflicts, history matters. You know, these colonial states, this projects of imperialism and stuff, this stuff really does matter. It's not just, like, you know, old news or stuff that, you know, is ancient history or something. It really does still play a part in things that are unfolding on Earth right now today. So just wrap with that.
Yeah, just real quick, though. I mean, that point's important because how many times have you heard, well, those people have been fighting forever, as the excuse to not, have to reform the U.S. foreign policy after a failure. So, yeah, Syria went to hell, and they're like, well, those people have been fighting forever anyways. Iraq goes to hell, well, the Sunnis and the Shias have been killing each other anyways. The U.S. the U.S. and the U.K. and the UN create an Israeli state in the middle of Palestine. Well, the Jews and the Muslims have been fighting forever anyways. And that is enough alone to not have to address the fundamental problems created with the imperialism in the first place.
Right. In virtually no case is that even true factually. Like, sure, you can maybe find some conflicts, but like nothing like what would happen after the imperialism and the intervention. Like in Iraq, you know, the Sunni Shia civil war, that was not happening previous to our invasion and stuff. So it's just, no, that stuff is factually not the case. But yeah, definitely encourage people to look into like the British and French and Italian and American, imperial histories here.
All right. Well, so yeah, find his work at RT. Find him on Twitter at WKP Libertarian Institute. A lot of his stuff gets rerun there. Of course, that's where you find the show and my daily news roundup. Make sure you're subscribing to the show somewhere. Share it because I think me and Will have smart things to say sometimes, and we'll get other people informed with your help. So thanks, everyone, and thanks, Will, for coming back on.
Thanks, Kyle.